The boot caught her in the ribs. Not hard enough to break anything, hard enough to make the point. "Get up," the man said. "You're blocking my door." Caroline Holt was on her knees in the mud of Deadwood's Main Street, hand outstretched, 4 days without food. And a stranger had just kicked her like she was a stray dog sleeping in the wrong spot. She looked up at him. He didn't look back. He stepped over her and walked into his shop, and the door swung shut behind him like she had never existed at all. She held her hand back out and kept waiting. If this story moves something in you, please subscribe to our channel and follow Caroline all the way to the end. Drop a comment and tell us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that mud-soaked street in Deadwood, Dakota Territory, October 1876. She had been on her knees for 20 minutes. Not because she had given up. Her legs had simply stopped holding her somewhere between the third hour of begging and the moment the shopkeeper's boot connected with her side. The cold was coming up through the mud and into her knees and her hands. The kind of cold that didn't announce itself, just moved in slowly and took up residence. And she was so hungry that the cold almost felt good. Something real to feel instead of the hollow, grinding nothing that 4 days without food had left in the middle of her chest. 3 cents. That was the morning's total. A man in a gray coat walked past without slowing. Then a woman with a market basket who looked directly at Caroline's outstretched hand and then directly away. The way you look away from a thing that requires a response you've decided not to give. Then 2 men talking to each other, their conversation rolling right over her like she was part of the street furniture. No different from the hitching post 6 inches to her left. She kept her hand out. She had been a legal clerk in Kansas City for 12 years. She had sat beside her father in courtrooms where men twice her age tried to talk over her. And she had let them try, and then she had put the correct document in front of the judge and let the document do the talking. She had read 40-page contracts before she was 20. She had caught a fraudulent land transfer buried in a water rights agreement at 23, and saved a client 60 acres and a farmhouse he didn't even know he was about to lose. She was 28 years old, and she was kneeling in the mud of a Dakota mining town with 3 cents and a piece of hardtack she was too disciplined to eat yet, because tonight was still a long way off. "Move on." The shopkeeper was back in his doorway. Different shopkeeper, same doorway, same tired voice. "You've been out here all morning." "I have nowhere to move on to," Caroline said. Her voice came out clean and level. Courtroom voice. Don't let them hear the bottom dropping out. "That's not my problem." "No," she said. "It's mine." He went back inside. She shifted her weight on her knees and looked down the street. The Gold Strike Saloon was 40 feet away. The assay office, where she'd been sleeping for 6 nights, was 3 blocks east. The county clerk's office, the one she'd visited 4 times in the last week, trying to access duplicate land filing records, was half a block north, and the clerk, a soft-looking man named Aldous Price, had told her each time that public record access required a filing fee of 50 cents, and had looked at her clothing when he said it to make sure she understood the cruelty of the math. 50 cents. She had 3. The satchel had held everything. $42, her father's original case notes, the duplicate contracts she'd managed to gather before Kansas City, the sworn statement from a surveyor named Hicks, who had agreed to testify before he abruptly changed his mind and stopped answering her letters. All of it gone. Taken off the seat of a wagon while she slept in the back on the road into Deadwood. Taken so cleanly she hadn't even heard it go. She pressed her palm flat against the mud and pushed herself upright. The world tilted hard to the left. She grabbed the hitching post. The horse tied to it shifted and blew air through its nose, but didn't pull away. She held on and breathed and waited for the gray at the edges of her vision to pull back. And it did, slowly, the way it always did now when she stood up too fast. And she thought very clearly and without drama, "This is the last day you can do this. Tomorrow you won't be able to stand up at all." She held her hand back out. That was when the boots stopped. She'd learned to tell in the last 6 days. Most boots had a rhythm that never broke. The even, purposeful stride of people who had somewhere to be and had already decided that her presence on the street was not going to interrupt their getting there. These boots stopped. Completely. No slowing, no hesitation, just stopped. 2 feet planted in the mud directly in front of her. She looked up. He was over 6 feet. Dark brown hair curling under the brim of a worn hat. Face tanned and angular from years of outdoor work. Dark eyes that were doing something she hadn't seen in 6 days of kneeling on the street. They were looking at her. Not past her. Not at the space where a problem was located. Not at the general category of unfortunate woman. At her specifically. At her face. "When did you last eat a real meal?" he said. Not a question exactly. More like a man taking inventory. "That is not your concern, sir." Courtroom voice. She had nothing left but that voice, and she was going to keep using it until she didn't have it either. "You've been on that post for 10 minutes, he said. "Before that you were on your knees for a good while. I've been watching from across the street." The shame of it landed harder than the boot had. "Then you've had your look," she said. "I'm not a circus." "No," he said. "You're not." He crouched down so they were level, eye to eye, which was not what she expected, and which made it harder to hold her face still. "My name is Samuel Reed. I run a horse ranch south of here. I'm going to the Gold Strike to eat supper, and you're coming with me." "I don't know you." "You can ask anyone in this town. I'm not a man who causes trouble." He held her gaze. "What's your name?" She looked at him for a long moment. She had spent 6 days learning what men looked like when they wanted something from a woman who had nothing left to protect herself with. She knew the particular quality of a smile that was covering an intention. She knew the way eyes moved when they were calculating rather than seeing. Samuel Reed's eyes were not calculating. They were patient and direct and waiting. "Caroline Holt," she said. He stood. He didn't offer his hand, didn't grab her arm, didn't do any of the things that would have made her pull back. He simply stepped to the side and left the direction of the Gold Strike open. "After you, Miss Holt." She let go of the hitching post. She walked. The warmth of the saloon hit her in the chest like a physical thing. Wood smoke and beef stew and lamp oil and the low sound of men talking. And her body responded to the heat before her mind could manage it. A long, involuntary shudder moving through her that she couldn't stop. She stood just inside the door until it passed. Samuel Reed was already at the bar. He didn't look back to see if she'd followed. She took the corner table he'd indicated with a tilt of his head, and she sat down, and she pressed her knees together under the table and held them still. He came back and sat across from her. "Beef stew and cornbread. I ordered 2. "Mr. Reed." She kept her hands flat on the table where they wouldn't shake visibly. "I need to be clear about what I can offer in exchange. You don't owe me anything. People don't help strangers for nothing. Some do." He picked up the coffee that had appeared in front of him. "And some have a practical reason that works out for everyone. You want to hear mine?" She said nothing. He took that for yes. "I've got a contract on my desk from a man named Clifford Marsh. He's a horse broker. Buys from ranchers in this territory, sells to the Army at Fort Meade. It's 43 pages long. He set down his cup. I've read it 3 times. Something's wrong with it. I can feel it, but I can't find it. And I can't find it because I'm a rancher, not a lawyer. He looked at her directly. Your hands have ink stains that didn't come from today. You were holding yourself like someone used to being taken seriously in a room. And you said that your situation wasn't his problem, like someone who's had to argue their case to people who didn't want to listen. He paused. What did you do before Deadwood? The food arrived. Thick, dark stew, 2 pieces of cornbread on the side. The smell of it hit her so hard her eyes stun. She picked up her spoon and took 1 measured bite. Then she answered him. Legal clerk. 12 years in my father's practice in Kansas City. Contract law, land filings, right-of-way disputes. Another bite. Controlled. 1 at a time. I can read a 43-page contract and tell you exactly what's wrong with it. That's what I need, Samuel said. Then we should discuss terms. She looked up from the stew. Room and board and fair wages. Nothing beyond that. Nothing implied beyond that. Your housekeeper present as a matter of propriety. Agreed on all counts. I've got a woman named Ruth Begay who runs the household. She'll be there. He watched her eat for a moment. You want to tell me what brought you to Deadwood? She considered how much to say. She had learned in her father's office that information was leverage, and leverage given away carelessly was leverage gone. But Samuel Reed had just agreed to her terms without negotiating, and that was either generosity or confidence, and either way, it deserved honesty. My father is dead, she said, 8 months ago. He was a contract attorney for 20 years, good one, careful one, and the Western Consolidated Railroad had him disbarred for falsifying documents in a right-of-way dispute. He didn't falsify anything. They manufactured the evidence against him. She kept her voice flat and factual, the way you present evidence, without the emotion that makes a judge decide you're too close to the case. I spent 4 months gathering proof. I had depositions, original survey records, a sworn statement from a witness. I came to Deadwood because the railroad's regional land office is here, and I needed access to the duplicate filing records in the county clerk's office. She broke off a piece of cornbread. 6 days ago, someone stole my satchel, with everything in it, including my money. Samuel Reed was quiet for a moment. The clerk charges 50 cents for record access, he said. Yes. And you had 3 cents. I had 3 cents. She met his eyes. Mr. Reed, I'm going to tell you something because you've been straight with me, and you're owed the same. My interest in your contract isn't purely professional. If Clifford Marsh is doing to ranchers in this territory what the Western Consolidated did to my father, I want to know it. And I'm in a better position to find that out, with a roof over my head and a desk to work at, than I am kneeling in the mud on Main Street. The silence across the table was a different quality than before. He was recalibrating something. She could see it happening. That, Samuel said slowly, is the most honest thing anyone has said to me in a year. It's the only kind of honesty that works, Caroline said. My father taught me that. Took me until he was gone to really understand it. He nodded once, the nod of a man who has made a decision. Finish eating. All of it. We leave in 20 minutes. Ruth's going to have the stove going. He stood and picked up his hat. Fair warning. She's going to take one look at you and have strong opinions about the fact that I let you sit here for 15 minutes with one bowl. She'd be right, Caroline said. Something that was almost a smile moved across his face. He went to settle the bill. Caroline looked down at the stew. She looked at the empty chair. She looked at her own hands, which had stopped shaking somewhere in the last 10 minutes without her noticing. She picked up the cornbread and ate it down to the last crumb. Ruth Begay was on the porch when the wagon rolled in, lamp in hand, arms crossed, watching their approach with the absolute stillness of a woman who had learned that patience was a more reliable tool than urgency. She was compact and sturdy, silver-streaked black hair pulled straight back, and she had the kind of face that had been watching people long enough to read them faster than they could read themselves. "Mr. Samuel," she said. Her eyes went to Caroline and stayed there, moving from face to hands to the state of her dress, to her boots, and back to her face in 3 seconds flat. "Ruth, this is Caroline Holt. She'll be working with me on the Marsh contract. She'll need a room." Ruth came down the porch steps and stood in front of Caroline and looked at her in the lamplight without speaking for a long moment. "You ate today," she said. "Mr. Reed bought me supper." "Once." "Ruth," Samuel started. "I can see what once looks like," Ruth said without turning. She looked at Caroline's hands. "Ink stains." "Legal clerk," Caroline said. Something shifted behind Ruth's eyes. Not warmth exactly, more like a door opening a calculated half-inch. "Kitchen's through the main room. I'll make a plate." She turned and looked at Samuel with an expression that had no words in it, but several clear sentences. Then she went inside. "I told you," Samuel said quietly. "She's right about the plate," Caroline said. He almost smiled again. "The office is the last door on the left down the hall. Contract's on the desk. I'll be in to check on you in an hour." 2 hours, Caroline said. "Don't rush me." She found the office by the smell of it. Old paper and leather and horse. The exact smell of her father's office on Elm Street in Kansas City. So precise that she had to stop in the doorway and put her hand against the frame and just breathe for one moment. Just one. Then she went in, lit the lamp, and sat down. The contract was neatly stacked. 43 pages, typed on an official-looking machine. Letterhead reading, Dakota Territorial Acquisition and Supply Company, in clean, professional font. She turned to page 1. She read the way her father had taught her. Not for comprehension on the first pass, for structure. Find the skeleton first. Understand what the document claims to be before you look for what it actually is. By page 4, she knew it was not what it claimed to be. By page 12, she knew it was deliberate. By page 31, she found it. Paragraph 4, subsection C. Written in language designed to look like standard indemnification boilerplate. The kind of language that appeared in hundreds of legitimate contracts and meant nothing. The kind of language a rancher's eyes would slide right over after 30 pages of dense legal text. It was not boilerplate. It was a conditional deed transfer. Buried in indemnification language, cross-reference to a penalty clause on page 19, that was itself cross-reference to a force majeure provision on page 7. Each piece meaningless alone, devastating together. If Samuel Reed missed a single quarterly payment, for any reason, including Army procurement cancellation, including weather, including acts of God explicitly listed, Clifford Marsh had the legal right to assume full ownership of the Reed Ranch and all its assets within 30 days of the missed payment date, with no right of appeal and no redemption period. The whole structure was elegant in the way that a trap is elegant. You had to read all 43 pages and hold all 3 cross-references in your head simultaneously to see it. Most people couldn't do that. Most people would never know what they'd signed until the 30 days were up and a man arrived at their door with a deed in his name. She turned to page 35, found another one. Different language, same mechanism, this one triggered by a change in Army procurement officers, an event entirely outside a rancher's control. Page 38, a third. She sat back in her chair and looked at the lamp flame and thought about her father's face the day the disbarment letter arrived, the way he had held it in both hands and read it twice, and then set it down on the desk very carefully and said, They planned this a long time ago, Caroline. This didn't happen in a month. She picked up the pen on the desk and began making notes in the margin of a blank page. The clock on the mantel said 10:30 when Samuel Reed appeared in the doorway. He looked at her face and stopped. "How bad?" he said, not a question. "Sit down," Caroline said. He sat. "Page 31, she said, and turned the contract to face him. "Paragraph 4, subsection C. Read it." He read. She watched his jaw set, watched his breathing go slow and deliberate, watched the stillness come over him that was not calm, but was the thing a man builds around fury when he can't afford to let it out. "I need you to understand what you're looking at," Caroline said. "This is not a mistake. It is not ambiguous language or sloppy drafting. Someone with real legal training wrote this and placed it deliberately in a position where a tired man at the end of 40 pages of dry text would not see it." "How many more?" Samuel said quietly. "2 more that achieve the same result through different triggers. There may be others I haven't found yet." She held his gaze. "Mr. Reed, you told me 12 ranchers in this territory signed agreements with Marsh. At least 12. Then you need to get me those contracts before Friday," Caroline said. "Every one of them. Because if they all contain variations of these clauses, what Clifford Marsh has built is not a horse brokerage. It is a mechanism for acquiring every ranch in this territory without firing a single shot, without breaking a single law that any court would recognize on the surface." She set her hand flat on page 31. "Because he hid the weapon in the language itself." The lamp threw their shadows long against the wall. Outside, the October wind moved across the Dakota plain, cold and indifferent. The same wind that had been moving across this land long before any of them arrived, and would be moving across it long after. Samuel Reed looked at the contract for a long time. Then he looked at Caroline. 2 days, he said. 2 days, she said. "And not a word to Marsh before I've read every contract you can get your hands on. If he comes early, you tell him you're still reviewing. You tell him your attorney is in from Kansas City and needs more time." "I don't have an attorney." Caroline looked at him steadily across the lamplight. "You do now," she said. Samuel Reed didn't argue. He didn't ask if she was sure, or tell her it was too much to ask, or do any of the things a man did when he was deciding whether a woman's competence was real or performed. He just nodded, once, stood up, and said, "I'll ride out at first light to talk to the other ranchers." "Don't tell them why yet," Caroline said. "Tell them you have questions about the contract language. Tell them you want to compare what you each signed. Don't use the word fraud." "Why not?" "Because the word fraud makes men do things before they're ready to do them. They'll go confront Marsh directly, or they'll talk in town where the wrong person hears it, or they'll panic and sign the contract just to make the anxiety stop. We need the documents first. We need to know the full shape of what he's built before anyone moves." Samuel looked at her for a moment. "You've done this before." "My father did it," she said. "I watched. I took notes." She looked back down at the contract. "Go get some sleep. I need another hour with this." He left without another word, and she heard his boots on the stairs, and then the house settled into the particular quiet of a working ranch at night. The distant sound of horses shifting in the barn, the tick of the clock, the wind against the window glass. She worked until the lamp oil ran low. She found 2 more clauses. Ruth was in the kitchen when Caroline came downstairs just past midnight, sitting at the table with a cup of tea and a piece of mending in her lap. Not asleep, not waiting in any obvious way, simply present in the way that certain people were present in a house, like load-bearing walls. She looked up when Caroline came in. She looked at her face, and then at the papers in her hand, and then back at her face. "Sit," she said. Caroline sat. Ruth got up and poured a second cup of tea and put it in front of her, and set a plate of cornbread on the table, and sat back down and picked up her mending. "How many?" Ruth said. Caroline looked up. "How many what?" "Clauses. Hidden ones." Caroline set down the papers. "5 confirmed. Possibly more." She looked at Ruth steadily. "How did you know?" Ruth pulled a stitch through the fabric and didn't look up. "Marsh came here 3 months ago with the first version of that contract. Before Mr. Samuel changed the terms, and Marsh brought back the new one. The first version was shorter." She set down the mending. "I brought coffee. They didn't notice I was still in the room." She looked at Caroline directly. "Marsh told Mr. Samuel that the other ranchers had already signed. He said it like a man who knew the answer to something before he asked the question. He was checking whether Samuel would sign faster if he believed he was the last holdout," Caroline said. "Yes." Ruth picked up her tea. "Mr. Samuel is a good man. He knows horses and land and hard work. He does not know how to recognize a man who smiles and steals at the same time." "Most people don't," Caroline said. "That's how it works." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "My grandmother's people had land," she said. It was said plainly, the way Ruth said everything, without invitation for pity and without armor against it either. Just the fact standing on its own. It was taken through documents they were told were agreements and were actually surrenders. The men who came with the papers were also very polite. The kitchen was quiet. "I understand that," Caroline said. Ruth looked at her. Something in her expression shifted, fractional and final, like a lock turning. "Eat the cornbread," she said. "You'll need your head clear tomorrow." Caroline ate the cornbread. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the wind pushing at the house, the clock ticking in the hall. And when Caroline finally climbed the stairs to the small room at the end of the hall, with its clean quilt and its window overlooking the dark outline of the corral, she lay down, still dressed, and was asleep in under a minute. She woke before 5 to the sound of Ruth already in the kitchen and Samuel's boots on the porch outside. And she lay still for exactly 10 seconds, feeling the profound foreignness of a soft mattress in a room with a door that closed. And then she got up. Samuel was gone before sunrise, 3 ranch hands riding with him. He'd left a note on the office desk in a plain, direct hand. Riding to Galt Ranch first, then Heller, then the Swenson brothers. Back before dark. Don't let Marsh in if he comes early. Caroline read it twice, and then picked up the contract and started again from page 1. She wasn't looking for more hidden clauses this time. She was building the argument. Every fraudulent contract had a spine, a central logic that held all the pieces together. And if you could find the spine, you could break it in a way that held up in front of a judge, in a way that couldn't be dismissed as misreading or misunderstanding. You needed to show not just what the language said, but what the language was designed to do. And to do that, you needed to prove intent. And intent lived in the pattern, in the consistency, in the fact that 5 separate clauses all functioned together toward the same single outcome, in a way that could not be accidental. She was on her 3rd cup of coffee and her 2nd complete read-through when she heard the wagon. She went to the window. The man driving was well dressed for the territory, a dark coat and a hat that had been brushed recently, a face that was pleasant in the way that faces were pleasant when their owner had spent years practicing pleasant. He pulled up in front of the house and sat for a moment looking at the building before he climbed down. And even from the window, Caroline could see him calculating. The small pause, the taking in of detail. She went downstairs. Ruth was already at the front door, filling the frame with her arms crossed. "Mister?" "Reed is not here," Ruth said. I can wait, Clifford Marsh said. His voice was warm and easy, the voice of a man who had never needed to push because charm had always opened the door first. I happened to be in the area and thought I'd stop in. Is that his new clerk I see coming down the stairs? Caroline came to the door and stood beside Ruth. Marsh looked at her. He was perhaps 45, broad-shouldered, with a neat mustache and eyes that were doing the same thing his voice was doing. Friendly on the surface, busy underneath. He smiled. I don't believe we've met. No, Caroline said. We haven't. Clifford Marsh. I do business with Mr. Reed. I know who you are, Caroline said. Mr. Reed isn't here. As I said, I'm happy to wait. He looked at her with that smile still running, and she watched his eyes move to the paper she was holding, and then back to her face. A flicker, there and gone. Are those the contract documents? There, Mr. Reed's papers, Caroline said. Can I ask what brings you out 2 days early, Mr. Marsh? Just neighborly, he said pleasantly. Of course. Caroline kept her voice exactly as warm as his, no warmer and no cooler, matching his register precisely, because a man like Marsh read tone the way she read contracts, and any deviation would tell him something. Mr. Reed will be sorry he missed you. He's been meaning to sit down with you and go through a few questions about the language in Section 4. Something happened behind Marsh's eyes. Small. Quick. The smile didn't change, but the quality behind it did. The way a sky looks the same color right before the weather turns. Section 4, he said. Standard review, Caroline said. His attorney from Kansas City is particular about indemnification language. You know how attorneys are. She smiled. Actually, you may not. It's a particular kind of particular. Marsh looked at her for a long moment. I wasn't aware Mr. Reed had an attorney. He does, Caroline said. I'll tell him you stopped by. He'll be in touch to reschedule Friday's meeting. Marsh's smile thinned by 1 degree. Not much. Just enough. I have other ranchers waiting on the finalization of these agreements, Miss Holt, Caroline said. Caroline Holt. She held his gaze. I understand. These things take the time they take. I'm sure the other ranchers understand that too, as I imagine their attorneys will also want to complete their reviews before anything is finalized. The silence between them lasted 4 seconds. Long in the way that certain silences were long. The kind where both parties were saying something that had no words in it. Of course, Marsh said finally. The warmth was back in his voice, fully, like it had never gone. Please give Mr. Reed my regards. He tipped his hat to Ruth, who did not move or change expression, and walked back to his wagon. Caroline and Ruth stood in the doorway and watched him go. He'll be back before Friday, Ruth said. Yes, Caroline said, but now he knows someone has been reading the contract, and he doesn't know how much I've found. She watched the wagon until it turned out of the yard. Which means he can't prepare for what I know. That's worth something. Ruth made a sound that in another person might have been approval. She went back to the kitchen. Caroline stood in the doorway alone for a moment, holding the contract papers, watching the dust Marsh's wagon had kicked up settle slowly back into the road. Her heart was beating faster than she'd have liked. She noted it and set it aside the way her father had taught her. You can feel it, you just can't show it, and you can't let it make the decisions. She went back to the office and kept working. Samuel came back at 4:30 with 2 ranch hands and 4 contracts. He walked into the office, still in his coat, still carrying the dust of a hard day's riding, and put the contracts on the desk in front of her. Galt signed. Heller signed. The Swenson brothers both signed, different dates. Carl Swenson said Marsh told him everyone else had already agreed. He looked at her. That was 2 months ago. Carl's made 2 quarterly payments already.
Marsh was here,
Caroline said.
Samuel went still.
When?
This morning. He said he was in the area.
She watched Samuel's face.
I told him your attorney from Kansas City was reviewing Section 4 and that Friday's meeting would need to be rescheduled.
A long pause. I don't have an attorney from Kansas City.
You have me, she said. And right now, that's what matters.
She pulled Carl Swenson's contract from the pile and opened it.
Sit down. I need you to listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you, because tomorrow you need to be able to say it yourself to the other ranchers.
He sat. He put his hat on the desk and ran his hand through his hair. And she noticed for the first time that he looked tired in a way that went past today's riding. A deeper tired, the kind that came from months of carrying something heavy alone. How many payments has Galt made? She said. 3. She found the clause on page 28 of Galt's contract. Different number, same structure.
Then Galt is already inside the mechanism, she said.
If Marsh triggers the penalty clause before Galt knows it exists, Galt loses the ranch and has 30 days to vacate with no legal recourse. She turned the contract to face Samuel and pointed. Look at this. He leaned forward and read. His contract has this too, he said. All 4 of them have variations of it. The triggers are different. Galt's is tied to payment timing. Swenson's older contract uses an Army procurement cancellation trigger. Your contract uses both. She stacked the 4 contracts evenly.
Mr.
Reed, Clifford Marsh has built a legal trap that encompasses at minimum 5 ranches in this territory. If the Army cancels or reduces its horse procurement order, which they can do at any time for any reason, every one of these contracts activates simultaneously. Marsh walks away with 5 ranches and a combined land holding of somewhere between 20 and 30,000 acres. The room was quiet. Who's he selling to? Samuel said. It was the right question. She felt something in her chest register that he'd asked it. Not because it was clever, but because it was the question that showed he understood what she was actually saying. This wasn't about Marsh. Marsh was the mechanism. Someone else was the purpose. I don't know yet, she said. But a man doesn't build something this precise unless he knows who's buying at the end. There's a railroad coming through Dakota Territory. 2 competing lines. The right-of-way acquisition is already being contested in the territorial courts. She picked up her pen. A consolidated land holding of 20 to 30,000 acres in the path of either line is worth 10 times what the individual ranches would sell for separately. She looked at him. This is the same pattern, the same legal architecture. Different territory, different victims, same company. Samuel was very still. The Western Consolidated Railroad, he said. I can't prove it yet, Caroline said. I need the duplicate land filing records from the county clerk's office, and I need 50 cents I don't have. She said it plainly, without bitterness, just the fact. And I need Marsh to not know what I'm looking for before I find it. Samuel reached into his coat pocket and put $2 on the desk. That covers the filing fee and whatever else you need, he said. She looked at the money. She looked at him. I'll keep an account of every cent. I know you will, he said, like it wasn't in question, like he'd already decided that was the kind of person she was and wasn't revisiting it. He picked up his hat and stood. I'll ride to the other ranchers tomorrow morning. Tell them to come here Friday before Marsh arrives. You can show them what you found. They need to see it themselves, Caroline said. I can point to the clause, but they need to read it. A man who reads a thing with his own eyes will fight for it differently than a man who is told about it. Samuel nodded,
I know. He was at the door when he stopped. He didn't turn around right away. He stood with his hand on the frame and looked at the wall for a moment. My father built this ranch, he said. He died when I was 19. My mother ran it for 3 years after that, until she couldn't anymore. When she died, I was 26, and I had $11,000 of debt and 22 horses and 4 ranch hands who could have left and didn't. He paused. I spent 6 years rebuilding it. Every fence post, every acre of pasture, every horse in that barn. He turned then and looked at her, and his face had the particular expression of a man saying a true thing in plain language without ornamentation. I would like to keep it. I know, Caroline said. He nodded once and went out. She listened to his boots on the stairs, and then in the kitchen, his voice and Ruth's voice exchanging a few low words, and then the back door, and then just the wind. She turned back to the contracts and kept working. At some point, Ruth brought in a plate of food and set it beside the lamp without speaking, and went out again. And Caroline ate without looking up, reading Heller's contract with one hand and holding a fork with the other. And the food was real and warm, and she registered it the way you registered something that had moved from impossible to simply true. The clock said 9 when she finally sat back and looked at what she had.
5 contracts, 12 confirmed clauses, 3 different trigger mechanisms, 1 consistent outcome. The pattern was clean enough to present, clean enough to stand on in front of a judge if it came to that. And it would come to that. She could feel the shape of where this was going, the way her father had taught her to feel it. That particular certainty that came not from hope, but from the logic of what the evidence actually said. She needed the county clerk records. She needed to connect Marcia's company to the railroad. Without that, what she had was a civil fraud case, winnable but slow, vulnerable to being picked apart clause by clause by a lawyer with more resources and more time. With it, she had something else entirely. She picked up her pen and started writing. She was still writing when she heard Samuel's boots on the stairs again, heavier this time, the walk of a man at the end of a long day. They stopped outside the office door, and then his voice came through it, quiet. You should sleep. An hour more, she said. A pause. Ruth said the same thing 2 hours ago. Ruth was right 2 hours ago, Caroline said. I'll be right in an hour. Another pause. Longer. Is it enough? He said. What you have? She looked at the papers spread across the desk, at the careful notes in the margins, at the 5 contracts laid side by side, showing the same hand in 5 different disguises. It will be, she said. She heard him stand there for another moment in the quiet hallway, and then his boots moved away toward his room at the other end of the hall, and the house settled back into its night sounds, and Caroline Holt picked up her pen and kept working by lamplight, building the case that her father had taught her to build, the only way she knew how to keep the thing that mattered from being taken by the people who had learned to take with paper instead of guns. She found the railroad connection at 2 in the morning. It was on the last page of Carl Swenson's contract, in the signatory block, where the name Dakota Territorial Acquisition and Supply Company was printed in clean type above Marcia's signature. Below his name, in smaller print, the kind of print that assumed no one would read that far, a registered agent line. One name, one address. A law office in Cheyenne, Wyoming. Caroline knew that law office. She had seen its letterhead in her father's files, in the correspondence that had accompanied the original right-of-way dispute, in the letters that had arrived with increasing pressure and decreasing courtesy in the months before the Bar Association complaint was filed. Marcus Aldridge, attorney at law, Cheyenne, Wyoming.
counsel of record for Western Consolidated Railroad in all territorial matters. She sat very still for a long moment. Then she picked up her pen and wrote it down 3 times on 3 separate pieces of paper, and folded 2 of them and put them in different pockets.
In the morning, she told Samuel over breakfast, and she watched him absorb it the way he absorbed everything, without performance, without noise, just a long stillness, and then a single question. "Is that enough to connect Marsh to the railroad in court?" "It's enough to start," she said. "The registered agent is a link, but not a chain. A good defense attorney would argue coincidence, shared counsel, common legal representation in a territory where qualified attorneys are scarce." She drank her coffee. "I need the county clerk records, today, before the ranchers arrive." "I'll drive you in." "I can go alone." "Marsh knows your name now," Samuel said. He said it without argument, without making it about her capability, just a fact he'd decided was relevant. "He knows you're here, and he knows you've been reading the contract. If he has someone watching the clerk's office, I'd rather you not be alone when you come out." She thought about arguing. She decided against it. "Fine, but you wait outside. If Aldous Price sees a rancher standing next to me, he'll assume I'm there on someone else's authority, and he'll be less forthcoming about what I actually need." Samuel looked at her across the table. "You've done this before." "My father did it," she said, the same answer she'd given him in the saloon 2 nights ago. She paused. "I watched him do it for 12 years, and I did it beside him for 4, and then I did it alone for the last 2 years of his practice, when he wasn't well enough to go himself." She set down her cup. "He trusted me with every case he had, not because I was his daughter, because I was the best reader in the room, and he knew it, and he said so." She looked at Samuel directly. "I'm telling you that so you understand what you have working on your side." Samuel looked at her for a moment. "I know what I have," he said. "I knew it the night you sat down in that office." Ruth appeared from the kitchen with a pan of biscuits and set them on the table, and looked at both of them and said nothing, and went back to the kitchen, which was somehow more expressive than anything she could have said. They drove into Deadwood in the early morning cold, the wagon wheels cutting through frost-hardened mud, the black hills rising pale and sharp against the dawn sky. Samuel let her down at the corner nearest the clerk's office, and pulled the wagon to the other side of the street, and sat with his hat pulled down. Aldous Price was behind his counter when Caroline walked in, small and soft-faced, and already wearing the look of mild inconvenience he seemed to wear as a permanent expression. He looked at her, and she watched him place her, the woman who'd come in 4 times, the one with the ink-stained hands and the worn dress and the insufficient coins. She put $2 on the counter. He blinked. "I need access to all land filing records for Dakota Territorial Acquisition and Supply Company," she said. "Every transaction recorded in this office under that name or any registered subsidiary for the last 3 years. I also need the original right-of-way survey filings for the Northern Pacific and Western Consolidated Rail extension proposals through this territory." She kept her voice crisp and professional, the voice that had once made men twice her age sit up straight. "Please." Price looked at the money. He looked at her. Some small calculation ran across his face and resolved into compliance, the way it usually resolved when the money was right and the request was technically legitimate. "That's several boxes of documents," he said. "I have time," she said. She spent 3 hours in the back room of the county clerk's office, sitting at a table surrounded by boxes of land records, working the way her father had taught her to work. Systematically, without impatience, letting the documents tell the story, rather than looking for the story she'd already decided was there. You went in with a question, not an answer. The answer came from what you found. What she found was worse than she'd expected, and cleaner than she'd hoped.
Clifford Marsh's company had filed land acquisition options on 47 parcels of Dakota Territory over the past 2 years. 14 of those parcels corresponded to ranches she could now identify by their contracted owners.
Of the remaining 33, 22 were currently held by homesteaders under federal land grants. 6 were contested grazing rights, and 5 were parcels that had changed hands suddenly and quietly in the past 8 months, transferred to the Cheyenne Holding Company, whose registered agent was Marcus Aldridge. The Western Consolidated Railroad's proposed right-of-way survey, filed 14 months ago, ran directly through 39 of the 47 parcels. She sat with that for a moment. Then she began writing as fast as her hand could move. Samuel was where she'd left him when she came out, sitting on the wagon board, hat tilted against the midday sun. He looked at her face and reached down to help her up without being asked. "How bad?" he said. 14 ranches, she said, not 12. 14 that we know of. And Marsh has been filing land options on surrounding parcels for 2 years, which means he started building this before he approached the first rancher. This was planned from the beginning. She organized her notes in her lap as the wagon moved. The railroad survey runs through nearly everything he's acquiring. Samuel, when those contracts activate, when Marsh takes the deeds, he can sell a consolidated 47-parcel land holding to the Western Consolidated at terms that would make the original ranch values look like pocket change. And the ranchers who signed get nothing, Samuel said. They get 30 days to vacate land their families have worked for years. She looked at the road ahead. This is what they did to my father. He found a discrepancy in a right-of-way agreement, a small one, a single parcel of contested land that a homesteading family had prior claimed to, that the railroad hadn't properly extinguished. He filed to protect them. 3 months later, the railroad filed the bar complaint against him, and the homesteading family suddenly settled out of court and moved away. She kept her voice steady. She'd had months of practice keeping her voice steady. My father never knew why they settled. I found the answer in the files when I was going through everything after he died. The railroad had offered the family money and threatened them with a property tax challenge they couldn't afford to fight. They didn't sell out my father. They just couldn't afford to hold on. The wagon moved through the frozen street, and Samuel drove without speaking for a moment, the way he did when he was giving her words the weight they deserved, rather than filling the space around them. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "I know," she said. They got back to the ranch at noon. The first wagon was already in the yard. Tom Galt was a large man in his 50s, with a face carved by weather, and a handshake that telegraphed 30 years of physical work. And he stood in Samuel's main room with his hat in his hands and looked at Caroline with the particular expression of a man who had decided to reserve judgment and was holding to that decision with visible effort. The Heller brothers arrived 20 minutes later. Carl and William Swenson came in together, just after 1. Carl, with his contract already in hand, folded and refolded until the creases were soft. 5 ranchers in Samuel's main room. 5 men who had built something with their hands, and their years, and their stubbornness. And none of them knew yet what they were sitting on. Caroline stood at the head of the table. She had laid all 5 contracts out side by side. She had marked the relevant clauses with strips of paper. She had written the key language out by hand on a single large sheet, so that the pattern was visible at a glance. "I'm going to show you something," she said. "I need you to read it with your own eyes, not take my word for it. Read it." She put Carl Swenson's contract directly in front of him. Page 28, paragraph 3. Carl read. His face changed. "Read it aloud," Caroline said, "so everyone hears the same words." Carl read it aloud. His voice was flat and careful, the voice of a man reading a thing he doesn't want to be true. When he finished, the room was quiet. "Now look at Mr. Reed's contract,"
Caroline said. Page 31, paragraph 4, subsection C. She watched them pass it down the table. She watched each face as the words landed. Tom Galt read it twice, his jaw getting tighter on the second pass. William Swenson looked up at her with something that might have been anger or might have been fear, the two expressions close enough at their edges that they were hard to separate. It's the same, William said. Same mechanism, different language, Caroline said.
In your contract, it's on page 34. In Heller's, it's on page 19. She put the handwritten summary sheet on the table. Every contract Clifford Marsh has sold to ranchers in this territory contains a version of this clause. The triggers are different. Yours activates on late payment. Mr. Galt's on Army procurement cancellation. Mr. Reed's on both. But every version produces the same outcome. If the clause activates, Marsh assumes ownership of your land within 30 days. No appeal. No redemption period. No recourse. Tom Galt put down the contract. I've made 3 payments, he said. Yes, Caroline said. Which means Marsh can't activate your clause yet. You're current. But if the Army reduces its procurement order for any reason, your next payment comes from a contract that may pay you less than your quarterly obligation. And one missed payment triggers the clause. The Army procurement decision comes out of Fort Meade in January, Samuel said quietly from his seat at the side of the table. Every man in the room understood what that meant. He timed it, Carl Swenson said, not a question. He built the contract so that multiple triggers become available simultaneously around the same date, Caroline said. January procurement announcement, quarterly payment due February 1st. The force majeure clause that activates if weather prevents delivery. She looked at each man in turn. He doesn't need all of them. He just needs one per ranch. And he chose a different primary trigger for each contract so that if one rancher figures it out, the others look different enough that there's no obvious pattern. Except there is a pattern, Tom Galt said. There is, Caroline said, and I've documented it. Every clause, every cross-reference, every trigger mechanism. I have the evidence from the county clerk's office that ties Marsh's acquisition company to a Cheyenne law firm that represents the Western Consolidated Railroad in all territorial matters. I have the railroad's proposed right-of-way survey that runs through 39 parcels Marsh has been quietly acquiring options on for 2 years. The room was very quiet. William Swenson said, "What do we do?" "You don't sign anything else," Caroline said immediately. "Not a single additional document from Marsh, not a modification, not an amendment, nothing. If he approaches any of you before we filed, you tell him your attorney is reviewing. You say nothing else." She looked at their faces. "This afternoon I'm going to begin drafting a formal complaint to the territorial court. I'm going to file for an emergency injunction to suspend the enforceability of all 5 contracts pending fraud review. If the judge grants it, and he should, the evidence is sufficient, Marsh cannot activate any clause until the case is heard." "And if the judge doesn't grant it?" Heller asked. "Then we go to the federal land office directly," Caroline said. "The railroad connection gives us federal jurisdiction. The moment Western Consolidated is named in the filing, this stops being a territorial matter and becomes something that needs a federal response." She paused. "It also becomes something that newspapers print." That landed differently than everything else. She saw it on their faces, the sudden understanding that the thing that had been a private dread, a private shame, a thing each of them had probably been carrying quietly and alone, was also a story, a public story, the kind that other men read over breakfast and formed opinions about. "You'd do that," Carl said. "Put your name on a public filing against the railroad?" "It wouldn't be the first time," Caroline said. "My father did it in Kansas City. They destroyed him for it." She held Carl's gaze. But the records I found in this county's clerk office will still be here after I'm pattern will still exist. The only difference is whether someone files it now or whether all of you wait and find out in February that you have 30 days to leave the land you built. The silence lasted for a long moment. Tom Galt looked at Samuel. "You trust her," he said, not a question. "With the ranch," Samuel said simply. Galt looked back at Caroline. He nodded once, the nod of a man who had made a decision he intended to keep. "What do you need from us?" "Signed authorizations allowing me to act as legal representative in the filing. The original copy of each of your contracts. And your word that none of you will speak to Marsh or any representative of his company before I give you the all clear." She looked at each of them in turn. "Can you give me that?" 4 voices said yes, one after another around the table, solid and unhesitating, the way men said yes when they had stopped being afraid and started being angry, which was a far more reliable state. Marsh arrived at 4 o'clock. He drove in through the front gate in his brushed coat and his carefully maintained hat, and he had a man with him this time, sitting in the back of the wagon, a large, quiet man in a dark jacket who stepped down from the wagon without being asked, and stood to one side in the way that men stood when their purpose was to be visible. Caroline watched from the office window. She watched Marsh take in the 4 extra wagons in the yard. She watched his pleasant face do the small recalibration she'd seen it do yesterday morning. That fractional adjustment behind the eyes. Ruth opened the front door before he knocked. "Mr. Reed is expecting me," Marsh said. "Mr. Reed is occupied," Ruth said. "I'm sure he can spare a few minutes."
"He'll be with you shortly,"
Ruth said, and did not move from the doorway. Caroline was already in the main room when Samuel came to the door and let Marsh in. The other ranchers were there, all 4 of them, standing or seated, their contracts on the table in front of them, and Marsh walked into that room and had 1 second where his pleasant face showed him exactly what he was looking at, before it closed back up into warmth and ease. "Gentlemen," he said, "this is a pleasant surprise." "Sit down, Mr. Marsh," Samuel said. Marsh sat. His eyes moved to Caroline. "Miss Holt, I didn't expect to see you presiding." "I'm not presiding," Caroline said. She sat across from him and put a single sheet of paper on the table between them and turned it to face him. "I'm representing. These 5 ranchers have retained me as their legal counsel in the matter of the contracts you've issued to each of them." She watched his eyes move down the page. "What you're looking at is a notice of intent to file for emergency injunction in the territorial court, citing fraudulent misrepresentation in contract formation, deliberate concealment of material terms, and coordinated scheme to deprive landowners of property through legal instruments designed to obscure their true function." She let him finish reading. "We file tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Marsh looked up from the paper. His face was still pleasant. It was the most disciplined, pleasant face she had ever sat across from, and she had sat across from some practiced ones. "Miss Holt," he said, "I think there may be some misunderstanding about the contract language. These are standard industry terms." "They are not," Caroline said. "I have documented 5 separate clauses across 5 separate contracts, all cross-referenced to produce an identical outcome through different trigger mechanisms, all written in language specifically designed to be undetectable to a non-specialist reader." She kept her voice completely level. "I also have records from the county clerk's office showing that your acquisition company has filed land options on 47 parcels in this territory, 39 of which lie directly in the path of the Western Consolidated Railroad's proposed right-of-way survey, and that your company's registered agent is Marcus Aldridge, who is counsel of record for Western Consolidated in all territorial matters." The room was very quiet. Marsh looked at her for a long moment. The pleasant face was still there. She watched it working, calculating, running through the options the way she had run through the contract clauses, looking for the exit, the angle, the language that would reframe what she'd just said into something else. He didn't find one. "That's a serious accusation," he said finally. "It's a documented one," Caroline said. "You can contest the filing. You're welcome to bring Marcus Aldridge himself to argue it, which I'd recommend you consider carefully, given that his name appears in my evidence." She folded her hands on the table. "Or you can release these 5 men from their contracts today, return any payments already collected with interest at the standard territorial rate, and remove your acquisition options from all parcels associated with their ranch properties." She paused. "Your choice, but you make it before 9 o'clock tomorrow, because after 9 o'clock, it's in the court's hands, and the only choices left will be the court's." Marsh looked at her. He looked at Samuel. He looked at the 4 other ranchers around the table, with their contracts in front of them, and their faces showing the particular expression of men who have moved from afraid to ready. He stood. He picked up his hat. "I'll need to consult with my legal representatives," he said pleasantly. "Of course," Caroline said. "Before 9 o'clock." He walked out. The large, quiet man fell in behind him without a word. They heard the wagon leave the yard. No one in the room spoke for a moment. Then Tom Galt said, very quietly, "Well," and Samuel Reed looked across the table at Caroline Holt with an expression that had moved entirely beyond the professional, beyond the gratitude of a man whose ranch had just been defended, into something quieter and more specific, something he was clearly not ready to name yet, but could no longer pretend wasn't there. She looked back at him for exactly 1 second, long enough to register it, long enough to feel the warmth of it move through her chest, before she looked away and picked up her pen. "I need to start drafting the formal filing," she said, "in case he doesn't take the offer." Ruth appeared in the doorway with coffee and said nothing at all, which, under the circumstances, said everything. Marsh didn't take the offer. She had known he wouldn't. A man who had spent 2 years building something this precise didn't dismantle it because a woman put a piece of paper in front of him and used the word injunction. He would have people to call. He would have options she hadn't anticipated. He would come back with something, and the question wasn't whether he'd fight, but what weapon he'd choose when he did. She filed at 9 o'clock, anyway. Samuel drove her to the courthouse in the early morning dark, the 2 of them sitting close on the wagon board because the October cold had sharpened overnight into something that meant business, their breath visible in the air between them. He didn't say much. He'd learned, in the week she'd been at the ranch, that she didn't need talking at when she was working something through. And she was always working something through. And he had simply adjusted to that the way he adjusted to things, without complaint, without drawing attention to the adjustment. She noticed. She filed it away in the part of her mind that was not currently occupied with territorial court procedure. Aldous Price looked at her filing, and looked at her, and looked at the filing again, and she watched him calculate whether the 50 cents she'd paid 2 days ago had purchased more trouble than he'd anticipated. He stamped it without comment and gave her the receipt. "Judge Harlan handles emergency injunctions," he said. "He's in court until noon." "I'll wait," Caroline said. She waited 3 hours on a wooden bench in the courthouse hallway, her notes in her lap, going over the argument the way she had gone over it the night before and the night before that, looking for the hole that Marsh's attorney would find, closing it before they could use it. Samuel waited too, not beside her but down the hall, leaning against the wall with his hat in his hands, not crowding her, not disappearing either, just there. At 12:15, a clerk called her name. Judge Harlan was a compact, gray-haired man, with the tired eyes of someone who had been asked to adjudicate the ambitions of difficult men in a difficult territory
for longer than was good for anyone's disposition. He read her filing. He read it a second time. He looked up at her over the papers. "You're not a licensed attorney," he said.
"No, Your Honor. I'm acting as legal representative under the territorial provision for lay counsel in civil matters, with signed authorizations from all 5 clients." She put the authorizations on his desk. "My father was a licensed contract attorney in Kansas City for 20 years. I worked in his practice for 12. The contracts in question are not complex in their fraud. They're complex in their concealment. The underlying legal mechanism is straightforward." Harlan looked at the authorizations. He looked at her notes. He picked up Carl Swenson's contract and found the clause she'd marked and read it, and then found the cross-reference she'd marked on page 7 and read that. "You found all 5 of these yourself," he said. "Yes, Your Honor." He was quiet for a moment. "Marcus Aldridge is going to appear on the other side of this." "I expect so." "He's been practicing territorial law for 15 years. He knows every judge in Wyoming and half the judges in Dakota." Harlan looked at her steadily. "He is going to come at you very hard, Miss Holt." "I know," she said. "I've been preparing for that." Harlan looked at her for another moment, the long, assessing look of a man deciding something. Then he picked up his pen. "I'm granting the emergency injunction on the grounds that the documented clause structure presents sufficient prima facie evidence of coordinated fraudulent intent to warrant suspension pending full hearing." He signed the order. "Hearing is set for November 4th. That gives Aldridge 10 days to prepare his response." He looked up. "It gives you the same." She took the signed order and walked out into the hallway. Samuel came off the wall when he saw her face. "Well?" he said. She held up the order. He took it and read it, and she watched something move through him that was relief, but deeper than relief. The particular release of a man who has been holding his breath for months and finally stopped. "November 4th, he said.
10 days, she said. I need to use every one of them.
They were halfway back to the wagon when she heard her name. She turned. The man walking toward her across the courthouse yard was not Marsh. He was younger, perhaps 40, with a lawyer's coat and a lawyer's measured walk, and a lawyer's face that showed nothing by default. He stopped 6 feet from her and introduced himself without offering his hand. "Miss Holt, my name is Douglas Crane. I represent Mr. Clifford Marsh and his associated business interests." He paused. "I've been asked to convey a message." "Convey it," she said. "Mr. Marsh is prepared to offer a full release of all 5 contracts, return of all payments with interest, and withdrawal of all outstanding land acquisition options on the relevant parcels." Crane kept his voice professionally neutral. "In exchange, the filing is withdrawn, the evidence gathered is surrendered, and no further legal action is pursued in relation to Mr. Marsh or any of his business associates." Carolyn looked at him. "His business associates," she said, "including Marcus Aldridge." Crane said nothing. "Including the Western Consolidated Railroad," she said. The smallest pause. "The terms are as I've stated them." She was aware of Samuel standing just behind her right shoulder. She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on Crane and thought about her father's face reading the disbarment letter, the particular careful way he had set it down on his desk. And she thought about the homesteading family who had taken the railroad's money and moved away because they hadn't been able to hold on. And she thought about 14 ranchers in Dakota Territory who didn't yet know a company had been quietly building a legal trap around everything they'd worked for. "No," she said. Crane blinked. Just once. "Miss Holt, the 5 ranchers retain their contracts releases and their payment returns. That part of the offer is accepted on their behalf because they are entitled to it, and it costs Marsh nothing he wasn't going to lose anyway." She held Crane's gaze. But the filing stands. The evidence stands. And I will be in Judge Harlan's courtroom on November 4th to present every document I have, including the records from the county clerk's office, including the registered agent connection to Aldrich, including the right-of-way survey overlap on 47 parcels. She paused. If Marsh wants to argue those documents are coincidence, he's welcome to try. Crane studied her face for a moment. You understand what you're declining. I understand exactly what I'm declining, she said. He nodded once, the nod of a man filing information away for future use, and walked back toward the courthouse without another word. Samuel waited until Crane was out of earshot.
He just offered you everything the ranchers needed. He offered the ranchers everything they needed, Caroline said. And they'll get it. But the railroad built this scheme in Kansas City and in Dakota, and probably in 3 other territories between here and there. And if I take the clean exit, they walk away clean, and they do it again somewhere else to people who don't have someone who can read the fine print. She started walking toward the wagon. My father found a discrepancy in a right-of-way agreement and filed to protect one family. They destroyed him for it. The least I can do is finish what he started. She heard Samuel's boots behind her. She heard him not saying anything, which was its own kind of answer. That night she sat in the office until past 10, and when she finally came downstairs, Samuel was on the porch with 2 cups of coffee and the particular expression of a man who has been sitting with something and has decided to say it.
She took the cup he held out and sat in the other chair and looked at the dark outline of the hills. When this is done, he said, what do you want to do? She turned the cup in her hands. She'd been asked versions of this question her whole life, by her father when she was young, and the world seemed like it might have room in it for what she wanted, and by herself in the years after he got sick, when she'd had to stop asking. She'd stopped knowing how to answer it. I want to go back to the county clerk's office, she said. Not here. Kansas City. I want to find the original survey records from my father's case. The ones the railroad claimed he falsified. She looked at the hills. I know where to look now. I know the pattern. If the same registered agent connection exists in the Kansas City filings, if Aldrich's name appears anywhere in the right-of-way documentation, then what happened to my father wasn't just an attack on one attorney. It was part of the same scheme, a larger version, an earlier version. She paused. And if I can prove that, the disbarment can be challenged posthumously. His name can be cleared. Samuel was quiet for a moment. That's what you've been working toward this whole time. Yes. Not just stopping Marsh. Marsh is the thread I pulled on, she said. My father is why I pulled it. He looked at her for a long time. There was something in his face she had been aware of for days, something that had been growing with a particular patience of things that grew slowly, but didn't stop. And she had been keeping her eyes mostly sideways of it, because she didn't know yet what to do with it, and she couldn't afford the distraction. You could work from here, Samuel said. She turned to look at him. I've got a good horse and a reliable wagon, and enough connections in this territory that I can get you access to records that Aldous Price would make you wait a week for. He kept his voice steady, the way he kept everything steady, without forcing it. And Ruth makes better coffee than any law office in Kansas City. You're asking me to stay, she said. I'm pointing out that you have a base of operations with a desk and an office and access to the relevant court jurisdiction, he said, and that you're welcome to it for as long as you need it. He paused. I'm also, yes, asking you to stay. She looked at him. She looked at the dark hills and the cold stars and the lamplight coming through the window from Ruth's kitchen, where Ruth was almost certainly not actually doing anything that required her to be in the kitchen at this hour. Samuel, she said, I came here with nothing. I had 3 cents and a piece of hardtack
and 4 days of hunger and a stolen satchel. I know.
I have no family, no permanent address, no license to practice law in this or any territory, and I am currently standing between 5 ranching families and a railroad company with 15 years of territorial connections and unlimited legal resources. I know all of that, he said. I'm telling you so you understand what you're asking. I understand what I'm asking, he said. He turned in his chair to face her directly. Caroline, I've watched you work for a week. I've watched you eat like someone who spent 4 days deciding whether to eat the hardtack. I've watched you build a legal case from scratch with nothing but your own knowledge and a lamp that needed refilling twice a night. And I've watched you turn down a clean exit because your father's name mattered more to you than your own comfort. He held her gaze. I know exactly what I'm asking. I'm asking if you'll let this place be yours. The wind moved across the yard. Inside, a log shifted in the kitchen stove. She looked at her coffee cup. She thought about her father's desk, which she would never sit at again. She thought about the smell of the Reed Ranch office, old paper and leather and horse, how it had stopped making her stop at the doorway sometime in the last 3 days, how she had started walking straight in without noticing, how it had become simply a room she worked in, her room, her desk, her lamp. The case comes first, she said. The case comes first, he agreed. She looked at him. Ask me again after November 4th. Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile, but was its origin. I'll ask you again on November 5th, he said. She looked back at the hills. She took a sip of her coffee. She did not say yes, and she did not say no, and they both understood exactly what that meant. The 10 days before the hearing were the most concentrated work of her life.
She reorganized the evidence 4 times, finding a tighter structure each time, eliminating anything that could be challenged as circumstantial, and building the core argument around what was irrefutable. The documented clauses, the cross-references, the pattern of identical outcomes through varied language, the registered agent connection. She wrote and rewrote her opening statement until it was exactly long enough and no longer. She prepared for every counter-argument she could anticipate from Aldridge, and some she invented herself because they were good counter-arguments, and if she didn't anticipate them, he would use them. Samuel brought her coffee. Ruth brought food. The ranch hands gave her a wide, respectful berth that told her Samuel had spoken to them without her asking him to. On the 4th morning, Carl Swenson came out from town with news. He rode in fast and came directly to the office door and knocked without preamble. Marsh has left Deadwood, he said.
Packed up his office 2 days ago. His man at the hotel checked out yesterday morning. Caroline looked up from her papers. Did he file a response to the injunction? Price says no. She sat back. He's running. Is that good? Carl asked. It's better than fighting, she said. But it doesn't close the case. A default judgment on the fraud finding is actually stronger in some ways. It goes into the territorial record without contest, which makes it harder to challenge later. She looked at Carl directly. It also means Aldridge isn't going to appear on November 4th, which means I'm not going to get the chance to put the Western Consolidated connection in front of a judge on the record. Carl looked at her. Is that what you needed? It's what my father needed, she said. Carl was quiet for a moment. He was not a subtle man, Carl Swenson, but he was not an unobservant one. He turned his hat in his hands. My grandfather came to this territory with nothing but a wagon and a bad temper, he said. He built that ranch by himself. First 2 years. No hands, no help. Just him and the land. He looked at her. I would have lost it in February and not known why until the deed came through in Marsh's name.
He put his hat back on. "Whatever you need, Miss Holt. Whatever it takes to finish this. You have it from me." After he left, she sat for a while with that. She thought about what it cost a man like Carl Swenson to say a thing like that. The specific weight of it. The way it landed different from a client's gratitude because it was not transactional. It was just the truth of what one person could mean to another when the timing of their arrival matched the exact shape of what was needed. She picked up her pen and kept working. November 4th came cold and clear. She put on the best dress she had, which was the dress she'd arrived in, clean and pressed now from Ruth's care, and she stood in front of the small mirror in her room and looked at herself with the same direct assessment she brought to everything. Not the woman who'd been on her knees in the mud of Main Street. Not quite yet the woman she was going to be when this was done. But someone in between. Someone who had found the thread and was still pulling. Ruth appeared in the doorway behind her. She looked at Caroline in the mirror, and she held out a brooch. A small thing, silver, simple, with a turquoise stone. "It was my mother's," Ruth said. "She wore it when she needed to be seen." Caroline looked at it. "Ruth, it's a loan," Ruth said firmly. "You'll give it back when you don't need it anymore. Which may be never." She pinned it herself at the collar of the dress and stepped back. "Don't let them talk faster than you think," she said. "You think faster than anyone in that room. Make them keep up." The courthouse was fuller than Caroline had expected. Word had moved through Deadwood the way word moved through small places, quietly and completely. And the gallery was occupied by men she recognized from the surrounding ranches, and some she didn't, and by women who sat with the particular attention of people who have a personal stake in the outcome. She saw the Swenson brothers in the second row, Tom Galt in the third, Heller beside him. Marcus Aldridge was not there. The court clerk confirmed it before Judge Harlan took the bench. No response filed, no appearance scheduled, no representation for the defense. Harlan came in and sat and looked out at the gallery, and then at Caroline at the plaintiff's table, alone, her documents stacked evenly, her hands flat on the table. "We're proceeding on default," he said. "Miss Holt, you have the floor." She stood. She had given this argument in her head 100 times in the last 10 days. She had given it to the office wall, and to Ruth's kitchen, and to the cold dark of her room at 2 a.m. She had given it the way her father had taught her to give it, to the facts, not to the audience, because the facts were what held, and the audience changed. She gave it now to Judge Harlan, quietly and precisely, walking through every document, every cross-reference, every clause and its counterpart in each of the 5 contracts, and then the county clerk records, and then the registered agent connection, and then the right-of-way survey overlap. Each piece placed next to the next, like stones in a wall, until the structure was standing on its own and didn't need her holding it up anymore. She spoke for 40 minutes without notes. When she finished, the gallery was very quiet. Harlan looked at the evidence she had submitted. He looked at her. He looked at the gallery, at the ranchers in their good coats, sitting with their hats in their hands. And he looked back at his papers. "The court finds in favor of the plaintiffs on all counts," he said. "The contracts are hereby declared void in their entirety, on the grounds of fraudulent misrepresentation and deliberate concealment of material terms. The defendant is ordered to return all payments with interest within 30 days. The land acquisition options filed by the Dakota Territorial Acquisition and Supply Company on all parcels associated with the plaintiff ranches are hereby nullified." He paused. "The court further notes for the territorial record that the evidence presented demonstrates a coordinated scheme of contract fraud connected to interests represented by Marcus Aldridge, attorney, Cheyenne, Wyoming, and finds that this connection warrants referral to the Federal Land Office for investigation of potential involvement by the Western Consolidated Railroad in the systematic acquisition of territorial land through fraudulent instruments. The gallery made a sound. Caroline stood at the plaintiff's table and heard Harlan's gavel and heard the sound of the gallery behind her, and felt something move through her chest that was not triumph exactly. Not the clean, uncomplicated satisfaction she had imagined when she thought about this moment.
It was something more complicated. Her father's face, and the homesteading family who'd taken the money and moved away. And Carl Swenson reading the clause aloud at Samuel's table in the flat, careful voice of a man reading something he didn't want to be true. She gathered her documents. She aligned them carefully. She held them against her chest and turned around. Samuel Reed was in the back row of the gallery. He was standing. They were all standing. The Swenson brothers, Galt, Heller, all of them on their feet, and other men she didn't know, and some of the women from the gallery. Not applauding, just standing, the way people stood for something that had earned it. Samuel was looking at her with the expression she'd been keeping her eyes sideways of for 10 days, and she looked at it directly now, let herself see the full weight of it. And it was exactly what she'd known it was, and she let herself feel that, too. She walked down the center aisle toward the door, and the gallery parted to let her through, and Tom Galt put his hand out as she passed, and she took it, and he shook it once, firm and wordless. And Carl Swenson did the same, and she walked through all of it with her head level and her father's case notes in her arms, and Ruth's silver brooch at her collar. Samuel was at the door. "November 5th, he said quietly. "Ask me tomorrow," she said. They walked out of the courthouse together into the cold Dakota morning, and the sun was coming hard off the frozen street, and the black hills were sharp and pale against the sky. And Caroline Holt walked beside Samuel Reed and thought about her father's desk and the smell of old paper and ink and the 12 years she had spent learning to read the language that people used to take what wasn't theirs. She thought about what her father would have said, standing in that courthouse hallway, hearing his name referenced in a federal referral order. She thought he would have said, "That's a start." She looked at the hills. "I need to write to the Kansas City Bar Association," she said. "I know," Samuel said. "And to the Federal Land Office." "I know. And then I need to find the original survey records for my father's case." "I know," he said. "And I know where you're going to do that." He stopped walking and turned to face her on the frozen street. And he looked at her the way he had looked at her that first night in the saloon. Not with pity, not with calculation, but with the patient, direct attention of a man who had decided something and was comfortable with his decision. "Come home, Caroline." She looked at him. The wind came down from the black hills and moved between them, and she felt it on her face, cold and real. The same wind that had been blowing across this land before either of them arrived, and would be blowing long after. "Yes," she said. They drove back to the ranch in the kind of silence that had nothing empty in it. The frost was still on the ground, catching the late morning light and throwing it back in small, cold flashes, and the horses moved at an easy pace, like they understood the day had already done its hardest work. Caroline sat with her documents in her lap and watched the hills, and let herself feel the things she had not allowed herself to feel in the courthouse, the things she had kept carefully behind the argument and the evidence and the 40 minutes of precise language. The grief of it. The clean, uncomplicated grief of a thing finished too late for the person it was finished for. Her father would have been 61 years old in February. He had not lived to see 59. She let herself feel that for the length of the ride home, and she did not try to make it smaller than it was. And Samuel drove and said nothing. And that was exactly right. Ruth was on the porch when the wagon came through the gate. She looked at Caroline's face and read it the way she read everything, completely and without comment. And she came down the steps and put both hands briefly on Caroline's shoulders,
and looked at her directly for one moment, and then let go and went inside. It was the most Ruth had ever touched her, and it was enough. The ranch hands came by ones and twos through the afternoon, each of them finding a reason to pass through the main room, or the kitchen, or near the office door, each of them saying something brief and genuine. "Heard it went well, ma'am," and "Good work, Miss Holt." And from the youngest hand, a boy named Pete, who was 19 and tried to hide that he had feelings about things, a single nod that carried the full weight of what he couldn't bring himself to say out loud. She thanked each of them. She meant it each time. That evening, Samuel found her in the office, not working, just sitting with her father's photograph in her hands. She'd carried it in her coat pocket since Kansas City, small and worn at the edges, her father at his desk in the way she remembered him best, pen in hand, head down, the lamp burning beside him. Samuel sat in the chair across the desk without speaking. "He would have known exactly what you did in that courtroom," he said finally.
What it cost to build it, what it took to stand up and say it.
"He taught me to say it," Caroline said.
I know, but he didn't stand there and say it. You did. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, the way he sat when he was saying something he wanted to land correctly. There's a difference between teaching someone to do a thing and watching them do it better than you ever could. He would have known that difference. She looked at the photograph. "He never doubted me," she said. "Even when I was 16 and walking into rooms full of men who expected me to bring the coffee. He would just look at me and say, 'Read the room, Caroline, then read the contract, then put the contract in front of the room. In that order.'" She traced the edge of the photograph with her thumb. "He made it sound simple." "You made it look simple today," Samuel said. She put the photograph down on the desk. She looked at Samuel Reed in the lamplight, this man who had stopped walking on a frozen street because she was kneeling in the mud, who had handed her a desk and a lamp and $2 and the space to use what she knew, who had sat on the porch with 2 cups of coffee and asked her what she wanted in the quiet voice of a man for whom the answer genuinely mattered. "You asked me something on the 5th, she said. He was very still. "I did." "You asked me to come home." "Yes." "I said yes." "You did." She held his gaze. "I want to be clear about what I mean by that. I mean, I want to stay. I mean this ranch and this office and Ruth's coffee and the sound of horses in the morning. I mean, I want to keep working, keep filing, keep pulling the thread until my father's name is cleared in every jurisdiction where the railroad put its hand." She paused. "And I mean you. I mean whatever this is between us that has been growing since you crouched down in the mud and looked at me like I was a person worth looking at." She let the words stand on their own without decoration. "I want all of it, if that's what you're offering." Samuel Reed looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood up, and he came around the desk, and he held out his hand the way he had held it out on that frozen Deadwood street. Open, unhurried, no force in it, just the offer. She took it. He pulled her gently to her feet and stood close and looked at her face in the lamplight and said very quietly, "That is exactly what I'm offering." He kissed her the way she had come to understand he did everything, with patience and intention and no performance. And when she kissed him back, she put her father's photograph face up on the desk where the lamp could reach it, because he should see this too. Ruth was in the kitchen when they came downstairs, sitting at the table with her tea and her mending, and she looked up at them and looked back down at her mending without expression. "Coffee's hot," she said. "Ruth," Samuel said. "I know," she said. "Congratulations. Sit down." They sat. Ruth got up and poured 2 cups and set them on the table and sat back down and picked up her mending and said, without looking up, "Spring wedding.
Not before. The ground's too hard for anything sensible before March, and I need time to prepare food worth eating." Caroline looked at Samuel. Samuel looked at Caroline. "Yes, madam," he said. The weeks that followed were the first weeks of Caroline's adult life that contained both work she loved and a place she loved to do it in. And the combination was something she had not known to want, because she had never had both at once.
She wrote letters to the Kansas City Bar Association, to the Federal Land Office, to a territorial judge in Wyoming whose name had appeared 3 times in the county clerk records in connection with Aldridge, to a newspaper editor in Cheyenne who had written 2 years earlier about railroad land acquisition practices and might be interested in what she had to say about them. The Federal Land Office responded first. A letter arrived in late November, formal and careful, acknowledging the referral from Judge Harlan's ruling and informing her that an investigation into the land acquisition practices of the Western Consolidated Railroad in Dakota and Wyoming territories had been opened. They requested copies of her documentation. She sent them copies of everything and kept the originals in a locked box under the office desk that Samuel had built for her from a piece of spare pine, solid and plain, exactly functional. The Kansas City Bar Association took longer. They wrote back in December, a letter full of procedural language that amounted to, "This is complicated and we are not in a hurry." She wrote back in language that was considerably more direct and included a 3-page summary of the registered agent connection between Marcus Aldridge and the original right-of-way dispute that had preceded her father's disbarment. She was not impolite. She was not ambiguous. They wrote back in January. A senior committee member had agreed to review the original disbarment file. She put that letter in the box with the originals and went to tell Ruth before she told Samuel, because Ruth had been there from the first night, had put cornbread on the table and tea in her cup and her mother's brooch at her collar, and some things needed to be said in the right order. Ruth listened. She nodded once. She handed Caroline a dish towel and said, "Finish drying these." And Caroline dried them, and they stood side by side at the kitchen counter in the December cold, and Ruth said, without looking up from the pot she was washing, "Your father was a good man who got in the way of people who didn't want good men in their way. The world has more of those people than it should, and not enough of the other kind. You're the other kind. So was he. That matters more than a committee letter." "I know," Caroline said, "but the committee letter is how other people find out." Ruth looked at her sideways. "Smart girl," she said. It was the highest praise Ruth gave. The winter was hard, the way Dakota winters were hard, with the kind of cold that made the ranch house feel both smaller and more necessary. The stove running day and night, and everyone drawn into the interior warmth of close quarters and shared work. Caroline learned things about the ranch that she hadn't had time to learn in the urgency of October. The particular sounds the barn made in high wind that meant everything was fine, versus the one specific creak that meant someone needed to go check on the horses. The way the vegetable store in the root cellar needed rotating every 3 weeks to prevent the bottom rows from freezing. The name of every horse in every stall, and the personality that went with each name. Samuel taught her to ride properly, not the way someone taught a person to stay on a horse, but the way you taught someone to understand one. How to read the shift of weight that told you the animal was uncertain. How to ask for a direction change through pressure rather than force. How to be still enough in the saddle that the horse could feel you thinking. She was a quick student. He told her so, and she didn't argue, which itself was new. She had spent so many years in rooms where competence was something to be defended that she had forgotten it could also simply be acknowledged. "You're good at this," he said, the 3rd week, watching her take a gray mare named Judith through a clean figure 8 in the corral. "I know," she said. He laughed. She had come to love the sound of it. It was the laugh of a man who is genuinely surprised by joy on a regular basis, which was rarer than it should have been.
and more valuable than most men knew. February brought two things. The first was a letter from the Federal Land Office informing her that Marcus Aldridge had been formally subpoenaed in connection with the investigation, and that the Western Consolidated Railroad had filed a motion to quash. The motion had been denied. The second was a letter from the Kansas City Bar Association informing her that the senior committee review of her father's disbarment file had identified several procedural irregularities in the original complaint, including evidence that the primary complaining witness had received payment from a company associated with the Western Consolidated Railroad 3 weeks before filing his testimony. She sat with that letter in the office for a long time. The lamp was burning. Outside, the February wind was doing its worst against the north wall of the house, and losing, the way it always lost, against something built solid enough to hold. She thought about her father sitting at his desk in Kansas City, reading the disbarment letter with that careful, precise attention he brought to everything. The way he had read it twice and set it down, and said, "They planned this a long time ago, Caroline." He had known, and he had not had the strength left by then to fight it, and the knowing without the strength to act on it was what had finished him. She picked up her pen. She wrote the Bar Association the most precise and complete letter she had ever written in her life. 12 pages, documenting every connection she had found between the original complaint and the railroad's land acquisition operation. Every cross-reference between the right-of-way dispute and the Dakota scheme. Every piece of evidence that showed the attack on her father had not been a response to his work, but a precondition for a larger plan that required him removed from the legal landscape before it could proceed. She wrote it for the committee. She wrote it for the record. She wrote it for every homesteading family who had taken the railroad's money and moved away because they couldn't afford to hold on. She wrote it for her father. She sealed it at midnight and put it on the corner of the desk to go out with the Morning Post. And then she sat back and looked at the lamp and let herself feel the full weight of what it was. Not finished. Not yet. These things didn't finish clean. But turned. The corner turned. The direction of the thing moved from loss to something else. Samuel's knock came at the door. "You should sleep," he said through the wood. Same words as October. Different weight behind them now. "Come in," she said. He came in and looked at her face and at the letter on the desk, and understood the shape of the evening without needing it explained. Because that was one of the things about Samuel Reed that she had stopped taking for granted. He paid attention, and what he paid attention to, he retained. And he used what he retained not to be right, but to show up at the correct moment with the correct thing. He sat across the desk from her. He reached across and put his hand over hers on the desk, and she turned her hand over and held it. "The committee found irregularities in the original complaint," she said. He nodded. "It's not a formal reversal yet. That will take months, maybe longer. They'll argue process and jurisdiction, and he's been dead long enough that the precedent for posthumous review is thin." She looked at their hands on the desk. "But it's in the record now. What they did to him is in the record. The next attorney they try to do it to, the next family they try to remove before they move in. There's a case on the books now that shows the pattern. That's how law works. One case at a time until the pattern is undeniable." "Like your father taught you," Samuel said. "Like my father taught me," she said. The spring came the way springs came to Dakota, reluctantly, and then all at once. The frost giving up the ground in stages, and the first green pushing through before the last ice had finished melting. Everything impatient to begin. They were married in March. Ruth had put her foot down about April, and Ruth's foot was not a thing to argue with, so March it was. The third Saturday, a clear day, with the mud just frozen enough in the morning to hold firm, and the sun strong enough by noon to make it feel like a promise. Pastor Elias rode out from Deadwood and stood on the porch of the Reed Ranch house with the hills behind him and the sky doing something spectacular in the blue and gold range. And the ranch hands stood in the yard in their best shirts. And Carl Swenson came with his wife, and Tom Galt came alone. And the Heller brothers came together and stood shoulder to shoulder, the way they did everything.
Ruth wore a good dress Caroline had never seen before and stood beside her as her witness with the silver brooch at her own collar. She had taken it back 2 weeks ago without explanation, and Caroline had understood completely. Samuel wore his good suit and his cleanest hat and stood at the porch steps and looked at Caroline walking toward him with the expression she had first seen across a saloon table in October. The one that saw her specifically. The one that had nothing in it but direct and steady attention. She wore a dress Ruth had helped her make through the winter, dark blue wool, simple and well cut. The kind of dress that said she was not pretending to be someone else, was not performing a version of herself for an occasion. Just herself. Just Caroline Holt, who was about to be Caroline Reed, and who had decided that was not a diminishment, but an addition. She had her father's photograph in her pocket. She had carried it every day since Kansas City, and she would carry it on this day too, because he should be present, in whatever way presence was possible. Because the life she was standing in had been built in part on the foundation of what he had given her. The desk, the lamp, the 12 years of careful instruction in how to read the language that people used to take from others, and the knowledge, above everything else, that her competence was real and was hers, and could not be argued away by any room full of men who wished it otherwise. Pastor Elias read the words. They said the ones required, and meant all of them. When it was done, Samuel kissed her, and the ranch hands made noise, and Ruth permitted herself a smile that lasted nearly 4 full seconds before she turned to organize the food. That evening, after the celebration had wound down and the Swensons and Galt and the Hellers had headed back to their own land they still held because of a woman who had read the fine print, and after the ranch hands had retired to the bunkhouse with the remains of Ruth's cooking, Samuel and Caroline sat on the porch in the cold March dark, with blankets across their shoulders and coffee going cold in their cups. The hills were dark shapes against a sky full of stars, the kind of sky that only existed this far from cities and electric light, the kind that made you feel simultaneously very small and exactly the right size. "I have been thinking," Caroline said. "I know," Samuel said. "You're always thinking." "I'm going to write to a woman I know in Kansas City, Margaret Foss. She clerked at the Bar Association for 12 years before they decided they didn't need her anymore. She knows the original disbarment file better than anyone alive because she processed the complaint when it came in." She took a sip of cold coffee. "She wrote me once, after my father died. A personal letter, not a professional one. She said she had always thought the complaint smelled wrong, and she was sorry she hadn't said so louder." "You think she'll help?" "I think she's been waiting to be asked," Caroline said. "Some people are like that. They have a thing to offer, and they've been carrying it, and they need someone to hold out a hand." Samuel was quiet for a moment. "Like a woman kneeling in the mud in October," he said. She looked at him sideways. "I wasn't waiting to be asked. I was waiting to have a floor under me so I could stand up and work." "I know the difference," he said. "It's why I stopped." She looked at the hills. She thought about the man she had been when she'd thought about meeting. Some future version of a man who would see past the mud and the hollow cheeks and the 3 cents to what she actually was. She had imagined him vaguely,
the way you imagine things you needed without quite believing they existed. She had not imagined Samuel Reed specifically. She had not imagined someone who would crouch down in the mud to meet her at eye level and ask a direct question, and then take her at her word. She had not imagined a man whose first instinct was to give her a desk and get out of her way. But he was the man who had appeared, and he was better than the imagined version in every way that mattered. And she knew the difference between gratitude and love, and this was not gratitude. "I want to find the others," she said. He looked at her. "The other territories," she said. "The same registered agent connection. The same pattern of contract fraud around railroad right-of-way acquisition."
It didn't start in Dakota, and it didn't end here. Wherever the Western Consolidated has been building lines, they have been doing this to people who don't know how to read what they're signing. She turned to look at him. "I want to find those people, and I want to put the evidence in front of every federal judge and every territorial court, and every newspaper editor who will print it, until the railroad cannot do this anymore to anyone." Samuel looked at her for a long moment. "That is going to take years," he said. "I know. It's going to make powerful people very angry with you." "They're already angry with me," she said. "They were angry with my father first. I'd rather inherit his enemies than pretend he didn't have them." He looked at the hills. He looked at his coffee. He looked back at her with the expression that she had come to understand was Samuel Reed's version of the most serious thing he could say. The face he wore when he was about to mean every word completely. "Then we do it," he said. "This ranch is a good base. The horses give us income and connections across 4 territories. I know men at Fort Meade and Fort Robinson who know men in Washington." He paused. "And you know how to read things that other people don't know are there." "Yes," she said. "I do." He took her hand under the blanket and held it, and she let herself feel the warmth of it. This man, this ranch, this life that had been built from nothing, from a boot in the ribs and 3 cents and a piece of hardtack, and the stubbornness to keep her hand out one more hour in the mud of a Dakota street. She had come to Deadwood to pull one thread. The thread had led here. She looked up at the stars and thought about her father one more time. Not the man reading the disbarment letter, not the man at the end, but the man at the beginning, the man who had sat across the desk from her when she was 16 and shown her a contract and said, "Read it all, Caroline, every word, especially the ones they don't want you to find. Because the words are always there. They just counted on no one looking." She had looked. She would keep looking. And whatever they had built in the language to take from people who trusted the paper more than they could afford to, she would find it, she would name it, and she would make sure it held up in the light where everyone could see exactly what it was. Caroline Reed had arrived in Deadwood with nothing but her father's knowledge and the will to use it. And she had turned it into justice for 14 families, and a federal investigation, and a formal review of a case they had been certain was buried forever. She had started on her knees in the mud. She would finish standing.